Berlin, 1941. The city pulsed beneath my window with a restlessness that never truly faded, a steady ache rising from the cobblestones into the cold apartments above. I remember the moment it all changed, the silence that followed the metallic click at the back door of my bank, the way my hands hesitated on the familiar brass rail of my desk. I had been Jacob Martin, the kind of banker clients trusted with trembling signatures and whispered secrets. But that morning, trust dissolved faster than ink in rain. I walked through the marble lobby and found the ledgers locked, the safe stubbornly frozen, and a junior clerk shaking as he told me, "They've been through your accounts. Orders from above." I would have laughed once at the thought that numbers, calm, obedient numbers, could be banished overnight. That what I'd built, minute by minute, ledger by careful ledger, could evaporate without a trace. But history doesn't ask your permission to upend you. The regime carved its will into our city, and in a single day I became someone else, the man without access, the banker without a bank. The air in my lungs turned heavier than the suitcase I packed that evening, filled with a few clean shirts and my last, carefully folded bank statements. The echo of loss bounced between my ribs, solidity giving way to a strange, hollow weight. There is a kind of fear that tightens with every new hour. It's not the sharp spike of terror, but the slow, aching contraction that comes when you realize your future, once measured in columns and compound interest, has shrunk to a handful of crumpled bills, a suitcase's worth of hope, and no guarantees past sunset. Outside, boots marched. Inside, I counted coins by candlelight, breath cold in my chest. Not all wars are fought with rifles or uniforms. Some are waged in the machines of bureaucracy, in the math of deprivation, or in the moments when dignity collides with desperation. In those moments, I confronted the most relentless adversary, the fear that I might not be able to pay for tomorrow. This fear does not belong to Berlin or 1941 alone. As I speak now, years and lifetimes later, I know it echoes in homes everywhere, even if the enemy no longer wears armbands or patrols the streets. Today's battles are quiet, personal, and constant. The letter arriving with another overdue notice. The ping of your phone as the bank balance dips below zero. The creeping sense that, despite every effort, the numbers aren't adding up. Credit cards cracked open one too many times. Wages swallowed before they reach your hands. Savings scraped away by invisible costs. Some nights, when the city outside was too tense for sleep, I'd stand by the window and watch the glow of kitchens across the alley. I wondered if, over there, someone else was counting, calculating, quietly coming undone inside their walls. When I listen now to messages from people who trust me with their own financial stories, I see how closely our struggles run parallel. We may be separated by history, by circumstances, but when money slips from your grasp, it stirs the same raw hunger for security, for dignity, for a path forward. So this isn't just about me, and it's not really about Berlin, either. It's about what happens when the future feels like it's shrinking, when we're forced to face the precise cost of survival and realize how easy it is to become a refugee in your own life. I learned then, sometimes through luck, sometimes through sleepless calculation, that even when the world tries to erase your name, you can draw new lines, find unseen routes, and guard what's precious with a discipline that no regime, bank, or crisis can take. How did I find my footing in a world determined to shake it? What does it mean, really, to fight back? Not with violence, but with strategy, courage, and a relentless commitment to value. That's the journey we share. Not because war threatens outside our windows, but because the smallest daily battles, the kind that rage in the silence of your bank account or in the confines of your mind, are the ones that quietly decide your future. And perhaps, through my story, we'll discover ways to move from survival to security together. As daylight broke that morning, the world rearranged itself in ways I had never imagined. Each sound in the street felt sharpened. Every knock at the door sent a ripple through me, anxiety walking alongside each step. Yet, beyond my immediate troubles, I began to see how beliefs, quiet, inherited, often invisible, shape what we notice and what escapes our attention. Without fanfare, certain ideas about prosperity and lack, stitched into me through years of quiet observation, began to assert themselves. In my earliest memory, sitting cross-legged at grandfather's feet, I listened to his stories of coins hard-earned and harder kept. There was a seriousness in his voice, a warning low in his tone. Money, he repeated, is a thing with more enemies than friends. My mother, placing away small change with careful hands, seemed to make every penny a mark of provision or a reminder of not quite enough. Conversations in our homes circled scarcity, a tale retold so frequently that, unknowingly, I wore those worries like a second skin. Yet, I'd never once questioned where those anxieties began, faithfully assuming they were simply the price of prudence. In those days, I never wondered if caution might sometimes masquerade as limitation. Much later, while my own life reeled with upheaval, I noticed patterns, instinctively holding back when faced with an opportunity, feeling a peculiar guilt at success, bracing for disaster even in moments of reprieve. It dawned on me, awkwardly at first, that my relationship to abundance was no accident. It was a script, rehearsed so well that improvisation seemed impossible. What surprised me was realizing how much of this script had been written for me by others, people well-meaning, but themselves shaped by struggle, wariness, and stories passed down like heirlooms. Yet, this internal script wasn't entirely my invention. Its fingerprints showed up in choice after choice, refusing invitations that hinted at extravagance, doubting the motives of those who did well, feeling unease in rooms where confidence and wealth were worn openly. Even among trusted friends, talk about salary or investments carried an unspoken tension, a code of privacy spun from old wounds and half-remembered lessons. Only recently did I sense how much was hidden in those silences: shame at falling short, resentment at others' ease, and a peculiar loyalty to suffering as proof of character. Contrastingly, I started to notice how neighbors, people growing up on the other side of the courtyard, perhaps, narrated wealth entirely differently. For them, talking about aspirations was not an act of hubris, but a ritual of hope. Their parents applauded ingenuity, framed ambition as virtue, and regarded setbacks as lessons, not shames to be concealed. I saw the subtle confidence this bred in them, a certain ease in risk, an ability to recover from mistakes without branding themselves broken. Their inherited scripts, it seemed, carried the latitude to dream, to stumble, and to try again. Curiosity drove me to ask, quietly, how these divergent storylines come to dictate our daily lives. I realized that just as we inherit the color of our eyes or the pitch of our voices, so too do we absorb narratives about what is enough, what is possible, what is allowed. Not every belief comes from a conscious place. Many rise unbidden in the backdrop. What gets praised, what goes unmentioned, which outcomes are mourned, which are celebrated. Sometimes a single sharp remark made in childhood, "We're not the kind of people who," echoes into adulthood, shaping every financial decision that follows. So now, I invite us both to listen for these echoes. In moments of hesitation, where does your voice end and someone else's begin? Is it your own wisdom that holds you back from asking for more? Or are you honoring family anxieties taken on as your own? Each of us holds an archive of invisible instructions, some loving, some laced with fear. Only by examining these legacies can we choose which pieces to honor and which to gently lay down. In peeling back the layers of my own financial story, I felt both lighter and exposed, vulnerable, yet curious about what freedom could mean if no one else's fear was making my choices for me. As dusk settled and shadows spilled across the streets, I found myself tangled in a world thick with stories, each one fighting to become the truth inside my head. The same rooftops I'd crossed with certainty now seemed to lean in, pressing rumors and warnings against my every nervous step. Rather than resist, I let myself drift into the city's quieter corners, away from wide boulevards where everyone hurried past the obvious. Here, beginnings and endings were softer, and in the hush, a new understanding took root. One evening, hunched over a borrowed desk lamp that threw my sharp-angled profile against peeling wallpaper, a man named Victor startled me with a theory that made me uneasy. "Jacob," he whispered, fingers tracing invisible patterns on a faded receipt. "Don't you realize the story of money is just a script we improvise with confidence? They want us obedient, to believe we're chained to what crumbs remain." Victor's ideas hung between us, daring me to admit how easily I'd let unfounded certainties dictate days and steal sleep. Rather than flee uncomfortable truths, I began cataloging the quiet axioms that boxed me in. No lesson was more painful than realizing how fiction dresses as fact. Over time, myths had crept into my routines, painting scarcity as virtue and struggle as moral. A particularly corrosive one insisted, against all evidence, that prosperity was suspect, rewarded by luck or inheritance, not earned through resilience or intelligence. My earliest clients, leaning in with trembling hope, often confessed to believing that fortunes could only be preserved by hoarding, shrinking, and hiding. They saw generosity as risk, growth as a gamble for fools, and clarity about money as vulgar pride. Yet, as Victor's words echoed, I found myself hunting for gaps in these old stories. Each time a neighbor entrusted me with a desperate stash of savings or hinted at dreams buried under rationed bread, I caught glimpses of possibility. These tiny rebellions against resignation, an apprentice teaching herself arithmetic by candlelight, a grandmother repairing shoes to fund a secret account for her grandchild, proved there was room for audacity within constraint. Their actions didn't erase risk, but they did redraw what felt possible. By witnessing others trade myths for action, I learned that truths could be more generous than fables. Reflecting on these encounters, I began challenging my interior monologue. Did I truly believe that small beginnings must end small? That those who speak of abundance must surely be foolish or dishonest? As I kept asking, cracks formed in the walls built by other men's cynicism. For each belief exposed, I experimented with a counterweight, imagining alternatives, speaking kindly about opportunity, and replacing internal critics with cheerleaders. I pinned affirmations in the margins of ledgers, committing myself to the view that worth could exist outside the boundaries outlined by fear. There was one moment, sharp as ice in memory, when real change crystallized. A young woman, known for fierce opinions and even fiercer budgeting, confided in me after weeks of wary glances. "Jacob, maybe saving can be a strategy for hope, not just survival. Maybe it's not about guarding the ashes of the past, but gathering fuel for something new." Her insight flickered in me, warm and insistent. Suddenly, I could see possibility not as a reckless bet, but as a kind of stewardship, tending to resources so they might multiply, circulate, and serve not only the next emergency, but a fuller life beyond it. New affirmations grew from there. I started my days reminding myself, the future rewards consistent courage. At night, I repeated, value is not about what I've lost, but what I'm willing to nurture. This subtle orientation toward growth, a willingness to disrupt inherited scripts and believe in recovery, altered both my calculations and my demeanor. Others sensed the shift. Conversations grew bolder, decisions more collaborative, and dreams, once rationed, began to breathe again. Now, standing at a crossroads marked by too many old warnings to count, I saw that breaking with myth was an act of compassion for both myself and those who relied on me. Each revised belief wasn't just a private comfort. It became a point of connection, a bridge from past wounds to shared futures. In that space, genuine transformation no longer felt theoretical. It tasted real, like the first bread after a long winter, nourishing new ambitions in everyone it touched. Late one evening, as thin sheets of rain tapped against the soot-smeared glass, I found myself confronted by a stack of unpaid bills weighed down by a solitary key. A reminder of how quickly locks can change, and with them, a person's fate. I could have let regret grind me down, but instead I chose action, however small. That first act was deceptively simple, arranging receipts by date, tracing each expenditure with a trembling finger. This unassuming exercise, barely more than shuffling paper, felt oddly like lighting a candle in a blackout. Numbers, previously ominous, turned navigable. Instead of trembling before the sum, I took measure of each part. Soon, I began noticing how subtle shifts fed larger changes. Before dawn, I'd sit quietly and assemble a list of overlooked blessings, from a friend's unexpected laughter to the comfort of wool socks pulled from last winter's trunk. These moments might seem inconsequential in the face of looming uncertainty, but they wove a thread of sufficiency through my days. Gratitude, applied daily, became a lever, Small effort with outsized results, lifting my mood just enough to make bolder decisions later. I wasn't hoping for miracles nor ignoring real anxiety. Rather, I made space for everyday victories that kept despair at bay. As days passed, a journal became my lifeline. Each evening, before fatigue sent my head nodding over unpaid ledgers, I'd jot down not just what had been spent, but why, who benefited, which needs took priority, what fear or hope lay beneath the figure. In time, I saw patterns emerge, a tendency to overspend for the sake of fleeting comfort, a reluctance to invest in what might multiply. Viewing these entries as raw data rather than personal failings gave context to mistakes, transforming guilt into actionable knowledge. The pages, once bare and clinical, started to hold sketches of future plans, provisional at first, then increasingly detailed as confidence found its footing. Through this painstaking audit of habit, I uncovered a new form of visualization. Mornings, before dread could gather, I'd close my eyes and picture not just stability, but surplus, enough to cover losses, but also to seed dreams. At first, the scene felt hollow, like pretending warmth from a painted fire. Yet gradually, as I repeated the scene with richer detail, a table set for those I loved, a roof sturdy against winter's worst, I felt determination refill hollow spaces. Visualization clarified the gap between where I stood and where I wished to move. In that clarity, action no longer seemed futile. My experiments bled into daily routines, shifting not only mindset but tangible choices. Faced with a neighbor in distress, I felt the old temptation to give away my last coins out of shared desperation. Instead, I paused, recalling goals written the night before. This time, I structured help, exchanging a day of labor for a shared meal, ensuring survival strengthened rather than undermined possibility. Small, incremental victories accumulated and, with them, resilience. Each deliberate step, no matter how humble, was both a fortress and a signal to hope that it could return again. Now, reflect for a moment. Picture the next time anxiety rises at the thought of a dwindling account or the worry of a mounting expense. Imagine yourself taking one small, deliberate step, noting the truth of what exists, honoring the effort you've made, then committing to a single action, no matter how minute. That points toward repair. By pairing attention with compassion, even our hardest nights gain direction, discipline, and the faintest spark of optimism. Each turn of the page, every number faced and named, every plan scribbled in shaky ink, they map a route out of darkness, sure as sunrise. Courage expressed through small, consistent actions becomes, over time, the quiet revolution that begins to remake an entire life. The voice of conflict was never just a whisper in my mind. It turned brash and insistent in the harshest of moments. That brittle November night, crickets sang outside while I wandered the makeshift corridors of my neighbor's boarding house. Not as a guest, not even as myself. I was reduced to a figure moving quietly, tracing each crack in the floorboards, longing for something, anything, that signaled safety. My reputation had collapsed along with my finances. Friends lowered their eyes first out of discomfort, then out of fear that I might ask for help. I became a stranger in rooms I used to own. It was staggering how fast the world shrank, how privileges dissolved, and how quickly I began to question every instinct shaped in years of security. The banker in me once drew solace from precise order, but that night, routine mocked me. Each plan for stability unraveled by dawn, replaced by harsh improvisations, none of which promised relief. I stared at my own hands, dirt-streaked and trembling, aware that comfort, so recently abundant, was now a memory as distant as childhood. Yet I couldn't retreat inward forever. Hunger always pulls one out. One day, Tilda, a vendor known for her stubborn optimism, caught me loitering near her fruit cart. Instead of the usual pleasantries, she shoved an apple into my palm. "Even the best roots need tending," she muttered, studying my worn coat. The taste of that apple was sharp, alive, as if defiance lived beneath its skin. In her gesture, I recognized more than pity. It was proof that dignity could survive, quietly, inside generosity. That realization was my first real lesson in redefining value. Not long after, I noticed how others like Tilda moved through their own storms with an upright posture, refusing to be measured solely by what had been lost. Unexpected clarity swept in as I watched her. The disaster I dreaded, financial, yes, but existential as well, had stripped away all unnecessary armor. Because of that, every ordinary interaction became radiant with subtext. If I lingered too long in the market, it wasn't to count coins but to listen. Merchants calculated risks in whispers, children bartered for bread, and an old tailor stitched pockets more capacious than ever before, hinting at the anticipation of hiding something precious. It struck me that the real battleground lay far deeper than ledger lines or hidden assets. The fight was for spirit, for the courage to reimagine what it means to have enough. This shift echoed through my choices. I stopped measuring worth by what I could accumulate or defend. Instead, I regarded each connection as currency in a parallel economy. One evening, while dusk seeped through window panes, I traded news for a warm seat in a seamstress's parlor. She mended a tear in my sleeve, and, in return, I mapped out a route for her to deliver parcels safely. It was a simple arrangement, invisible to anyone seeking obvious gain, but what we traded, protection for comfort, became the scaffolding for renewed confidence. A series of small, collaborative victories formed the blueprint for this new way of thinking. Collaboration, I realized, was worth more than secrecy or solitary striving. This was not merely a means of survival, but a source of antagonistic pride, a way to oppose the world's attempt to reduce us to silence. The more I relied on quiet alliances, the more I reclaimed a sense of selfhood previously threatened by chaos. I learned firsthand how trust, once built, becomes a vital shield. Looking back, these moments are stitched together by a sense of renewal. With every exchange, each shared risk and reciprocated kindness, the world inched open. It no longer belonged solely to those with unscathed fortunes, but to everyone willing to risk vulnerability for the sake of mutual restoration. The contours of my old life softened and gave way to a future shaped not by possession, but by persistent reinvention. Even if the past whispered of loss, I answered it, day by day, with small decisions that affirmed my place in the world. Steam hissed upward as I pressed a copper coin into Elisa's palm, her warm fingers curling around it with a trust that surprised us both. She'd waited outside the dim bakery for me, waving a folded note, another family in need, another plea scrawled in pencil. In moments like this, an unexpected sense of responsibility would surge through me, a reminder that financial hardship doesn't only sever livelihoods, it exposes who we are beneath the surface. In those smog-filled days, what changed me most wasn't just outside pressure, but the slow ignition of something within. There, amid ration lines and coded glances, identity became an instrument far sharper than any ledger. Growing up, I believed my character attached directly to my accounts, savings as virtue, success as proof. Suddenly stripped of both, I was forced to reconsider who I truly was when no externals remained. My hands bear witness to that transformation, calloused not solely from lifting ledgers, but from hauling sacks of potatoes for neighbors and surreptitiously exchanging coins in the market shadows. These gestures, so small and instinctive, rewrote my sense of self every day. As we mapped silent routes between safe houses and back alleys, I became unexpectedly attuned to motivation and intent. Material deprivation revealed what sustained me and what did not. Did I measure value by fleeting transactions, or by how I cultivated trust and resilience in others? Victor, always quick with skepticism, once muttered as he stitched the lining of a battered coat, "Crisis doesn't make men. It shows which part of the man steps forward." I knew then that my ability to respond wasn't determined by dwindling assets, but by the convictions I chose to animate. Moving through those narrow, lantern-lit courtyards, I saw how people's self-concepts display themselves by how they treat resources, no matter how scarce. For some, hoarding every scrap signified security. For others, pooling resources became a form of collective defiance and hope. My own patterns unraveled before me. Sometimes I hesitated, clinging to the last few coins out of fear that I'd lose the remnants of my old self. At other times, I'd catch myself acting with a generosity that grew from a new understanding. If I defined myself by service and ingenuity, scarcity couldn't reduce me, only refine me. Besides, adopting this altered identity meant stepping into roles I'd once dismissed as impossible. My sister, Greta, who'd always laughed at my banker's pride, joined me in these secretive errands. We drew a map together on the underside of a bread tin, each crossing marking an act of preservation for someone else. In that shared conspiracy, I discovered humility without humiliation, realizing that taking meticulous care of what little remained could be every bit as noble as granting loans during easier times. Simultaneously, I learned to distinguish between the hollow pride of appearance and the sturdier confidence born from adaptation. Nights spent reorganizing saved scraps, cloth, bits of ribbon, even old walking sticks, taught me to redefine abundance itself. Perhaps riches weren't measured in gold anymore, but in the number of lives made just a little less perilous by our efforts. At first, the thought was jarring, but soon, the quiet pride in these anonymous acts filled the silence where my old ambitions used to roar. Looking back, I see now that these stresses didn't diminish my core, they distilled it. By embracing new roles and tempering ego with responsibility, I began to inhabit a truer, richer identity, one unshaken by loss, empowered by meaning. That new self, once a stranger amid comfort, was now my closest ally in adversity. This transformed me from a man obsessed with what I owned to someone fiercely protective of what I could foster, even when circumstances threatened to erase every evidence of my past self. Reflecting on this journey so far, I sense the accumulated weight of memory and the subtle shift of perception, like a hall filling with dawn that banishes the night's uncertainty, yet reveals dust motes swirling in the softening light. Those dust motes, I realize, are pieces of old identity catching sunlight, refracting intent in new directions. The rhythm of my days, once dictated by a narrow notion of security, now flutters with a wider pulse, sometimes fragile, sometimes persistent, but always nudging me forward. Each strained encounter, every tested relationship, has become a thread tightening a tapestry I hardly knew I was weaving. If my hands were once taut with rigidity, trying to grip what slipped too easily through my fingers, now they move with a steadier confidence. There is a kind of learning that arrives not as information, but as quiet embodiment. Going from one slip of chance to another, it's as if I have been walking a corridor littered with puzzle pieces, turning each one in my palm, uncertain if they fit together until, suddenly, the emerging picture hints at cohesion. This isn't arrival, but the gift of seeing a pattern at last where only fragments once lingered. Listening to the low conversations in lamplit kitchens, watching stoic faces soften in the presence of unexpected kindness, made me reconsider origins. So much of our path isn't constructed through grand declarations or deliberate plans, but through the granular courage expressed, sometimes unwittingly, in tiny moments. In the hush between questions and answers, a new outlook quietly takes root. Over time, the silence that once pressed so heavily now transforms. What was oppressive becomes fertile, making room for questions that don't bend to old logic. Even the unspoken begins to shift. The language of worry, once all-consuming, gradually makes room for something gentler. A careful curiosity, a willingness to risk a more generous interpretation of fate. On the rain-dark pavements, I've often watched my reflection split and blur under passing horseshoes and carriage wheels. For so long, I mistook those shifting figures for a kind of loss, shadows left behind by fortune's withdrawal. But the longer I observed, the more I sensed an invitation, each reshaped outline not a vanishing, but a beckoning toward a different selfhood. When we are disciplined by circumstance, it is tempting to believe we must choose between vigilance and hope. Yet, in those moments when a decision must be made with little certainty, it is possible to witness the gradual convergence of restraint and vision. Necessity and imagination become unlikely companions. Often, I think of those first hesitant footfalls, the sense of trespassing even in familiar streets, as if the soil itself resented my presence. Yet, with every small act claimed, each instinct recalibrated, my own footsteps have begun to ring with newer clarity, not as echoes of scarcity, but as declarations of intent. It is here, in the muted alchemy of modest acts, that a strange invitation whispers, to pause, to look up, to entertain a loyalty to what might still flourish. The passage through confusion and recalibration isn't a straight road, but a spiral, each revolution deepening, never quite circling back to the same point. For those listening now, traveling beside me through uncertainty and quiet recalibration, I invite you to notice the subtle metamorphosis within your own narrative. The journey, far from a linear ascent, bends and folds, sometimes bringing us back to familiar crossroads with eyes newly opened. In the quiet accumulation of awareness, in the slow forging of new patterns, an unanticipated anticipation grows. Standing on the threshold, we sense the possibility of shaping not only our circumstances, but also the character with which we meet them. The horizon, previously obscured, begins to reveal its contours, waiting for the next deliberate step. As daylight gave way to dusk on yet another uncertain evening, I found myself looking in the reflection of a store window, cheeks drawn from hunger, eyes flecked with a resilience I hadn't known was mine. Each pane was cold to the touch, and I pressed my palm against it, half expecting warmth from inside to greet me. Of course, there was only the coolness of glass, the faint outline of my face, and the city shifting in the background. In that glimmer, jagged and unsure, I traced evidence of my journey. A life battered by confiscation, loss, nights spent measuring hope in coins, and yet also stitched with improbably tender moments. An apple pressed into my hand, laughter bought with nothing, a meal quietly shared so fate could be defied. What struck me most, standing so exposed, was the realization that hardship had not emptied me out, but illuminated corners I'd never thought to explore. When I look back, it's not deprivation that stands out, but the odd music that came from persistence, the rhythm of edges pushed, values reimagined, the unspooling of an identity uncoupled from everything external. Across these months, survival stopped being a posture of defense and started looking more like an honest conversation with possibility. Each scar, each new routine, called me toward reinvention, not as an act of forgetting, but as a daring kind of honesty. One evening, as heavy clouds pressed low and the first scent of rain drew out the scent of old timber, I drifted into a darkened bakery just as closing bells rang. The baker, hair dusted with flour, looked at me with a question in his eyes. Without a word, I offered to sweep the floors in exchange for a crust of bread. He considered, then nodded, pushing aside the register to let me pass. The broom handle was rough, the work repetitive, but the exchange spoke of dignity restored. I could contribute. I could transform need into something of value again, even in a place stripped of former status. Outside, the sky released a torrent. Inside, I sat in orange lamp glow, steam rising from my meal, feeling, for the first time in ages, a tremor of assurance deep beneath my ribs. From these moments surfaced an understanding that endures. Prosperity is not a static ledger or a title bestowed. It is animated by adaptability, by the willingness to negotiate with uncertainty and find meaning in each line redrawn. I learned that resources, once guarded as possessions, become far more potent when they circulate through connection and care, when what I protect serves not just my own survival, but the future of those who walk beside me, known and unknown. In this, a different wealth emerged, my sense of agency, self-respect, the inner permission to trust that renewal is not only possible, but inevitable for those who refuse to be reduced by circumstance. Now, as streetlights flicker and footsteps scatter in all directions, I am left with a lingering conviction. We are not uniquely condemned by our setbacks, nor are we defined by every missed opportunity or faded asset. When we respond with invention and courage, when we choose purpose over despair, we manufacture abundance even from rags. And so, when I press my palm to the window these days, I no longer see only lost time or vanished fortune, but a record of every risk taken, every boundary transcended, every small act that mattered. That, I believe, is the true currency, one no regime, no debt, nor distant disaster can confiscate. If tonight you find yourself tracing figures in dim light, wrestling with questions about enoughness, take heart. Every ending conceals a dormant beginning, ready for you to claim. There is a story yet to be shaped inside your hands. Untold, unwritten, waiting for the courage that arises the instant you decide to answer it.